I guess I would sort of emphasize that we're kind of at the beginning of something from my point of view, that's quite profound as it relates to healthcare. And I think that's exemplified by these books. So maybe you don't need to see one at the moment. Hang on a second. We go into, all right. So the book on the left is really about the idea that information technology represents a machine age. There's nothing new there. I think the major thesis of the book, which I find interesting, is that there is evidence that things are happening much faster than we anticipated. And an example of that would be Google Car. So everybody anticipated that there would be a self-drive car, but it actually happened quicker than most of us would have thought. And I think that happened in part because of changes in technology. And of course, the Google car works by the fact that there are a set of sensors on the roof that actually process 750 megabytes of data per second in real time to provide all of the sensing needed for that car to drive carefully. So it's just a side of the ability to process large amounts of data in real time. The book on the left is actually also very interesting, and it's sort of exemplified by the slide at the bottom, which talks about the exponential growth and the 6 Ds associated with it. The first D, and we've seen this obviously in other industries like print, newspapers, music, where something becomes digitized, and then immediately it's not really evident that there's much of a difference. There's a sort of deceptive phase, and that's because what's happening is very low on the exponential growth curve, and doubling doesn't actually mean very much at that stage, but of course that changes. At that point, it begins to become disruptive, and then ultimately you see a whole series of other events taking place, changing economic models, and the piece that really interests me is it becomes democratized. And I think I would argue that healthcare is now within that digitized phase. I think the emergence of the electronic health record as a digital entity. Of course, we've had genomic information as being digital for quite some time, but the emergence of other types of information that relate to healthcare, for example, mobile health information that come from devices like Fitbits and so forth, that is now all potentially or is digital and is, I would argue, in a deceptive phase. And it will be interesting to see whether, as it starts to ramp up the exponential curve, we start to see the same dramatic changes that we're seeing or have seen in other industries. And, we're sort of at the NIH planning for that. And on the next slide, it just sort of illustrates a timeline of how this came about. So back in 2012, Dr. Collins, as director of the NIH, had convened a working group to look at informatics and data within the NIH and what we should be doing about it. That led to Eric Green taking on a role of kicking this off. But one of the recommendations was to hire a chief data czar for the NIH. I agreed to go and do that started in March of last year. And I report directly to Dr. Collins in that capacity. And you can see some of the findings of that working group. So the idea that we need to have better cataloging of data and software, support methods and application development in a more rigorous and ongoing and robust way than we had in the past. And the need for more training, the workforce development aspect, is clearly very important, and so on. So these activities are now underway, and they're embraced in something that we call the Big Data to Knowledge Initiative. Next slide. So, what have I learned so far in this process? If you just sort of step through these different bullets, I think, first of all, that we're dealing with what I would call extreme translation. We're dealing with many different data types that range from simple genomic information through proteomics, metabolomics, imaging information as appears in various kinds of radiology, for example, but in many other places as well, all the way up to patient cohorts. And you'll see, with respect to the precision medicine initiative I mentioned a minute, we're now talking about very large cohorts. But making change. So when I first started the NIH, I said to Dr. Collins on my first week, well, what is my, tell me my job description in one sentence. And he said it's to change the culture of NIH. And my response was, well, what shall I do next week? But clearly things like that take a long time. But I think we are making a little progress. But there are complexities that I could never have imagined going into this. Let me just outline one of them to you, just to illustrate something I've learned about the system in the time I've been there. So I thought it would be a good idea to have a workshop with gamers. So we brought in 15 or 20 folks, most of them about a third of my age, but virtually all of them probably richer than I am, to actually work with biomedical researchers for a couple of days to identify the problems that they had and understand how gaming technologies, visualization, spatial recognition, all sorts of network traversal types of activities could really facilitate biomedical research. And it was very vibrant and successful, and it led to the development of a funding call to bring these folks together. The day before we put that out, I got a rather panicky call that this had to stop. And the reason it had to stop is because, as we're being recorded, I won't mention who, but a Congress person who'd just written an op-ed piece in the Washington Post that said, effectively, that NIH should not be playing games, they should be curing Alzheimer's. And, I think that missed the point of what we were doing, obviously. But what I didn't realize is the connotations that has. That person who was not actually on the Appropriations Committee, but certainly had been and could influence that committee, could ultimately lead to, if they got to be in their bonnet about this, shaving millions of dollars off, hundreds of millions of dollars off the NIH budget, which would be catastrophic to all of the folks there on what I regard as a fairly fragile food chain. So, the point is that things are not as easy as I would have thought, but at the same time, we actually figured out a way to do this, and it's kind of moving forward anyway. So, but there are complexities I hadn't realized. Next slide. I think there's also aspects that are important to this. You'll see in a second how we're sort of structuring things. But the idea of policies, so you just flip through again these various bullets. I think there are two types of policies effectively. There are those that are driven by the community from the bottom up, which actually tend to be adhered to more, in my opinion. And then there are policies that come from the top down that can be problematic. An example of that would be the Holdren memo, which is effectively saying that all data generated by on public money really should be available to the public. Well, in the research space, clearly that, for many of us, that's highly desirable. And so the how of doing that is, or the why for doing it, sorry, is pretty clear. How you actually enforce that policy is another matter altogether. And whether you have the infrastructure to support such a policy. These are sort of things that come forward as an unfunded mandate and become problematic to actually implement. So we are making some progress there, and I'll tell you about that in a second. I think the other thing I've learned in the year I've been at the NIH is that you end up doing a lot of things that you never anticipated in the beginning because they just come out of left field. Two of those, which I'll say something about, are precision medicine and what I call the National Library of Medicine Rethink, which I'll get to in a second. But this is all just the beginning, all right? So I think the precision medicine initiative is, and Dr. Collins has said that he anticipates that this will be, have greater impact on what the NIH is doing than the Human Genome Project had. So this is an initiative that is, President Obama is really behind, and it was announced on January the 30th. It was actually mentioned in the State of the Union address. There was a rollout on January 30th, and we're actively working on putting this into place right now. There's an appropriation of $215 million, and the intent is to, there's two parts to it. A relatively short-term part that relates to accelerating the use of cancer genomics, which is having really quite a profound impact on our study of cancer. That's the sort of short-term part. The longer-term part is developing a cohort of over 1 million patients for which very complete health records will be gathered, and that will be used as a research tool. And obviously there are lots of issues around that in terms of policies with respect to consent and privacy, but also there is just an amazing opportunity to, for the first time I think in history, put the patient at the center of the healthcare system, which sounds a bit silly, but that's my personal view of it. And the patient becomes really empowered by their own information. And we can certainly talk more about that if you have questions about it. And I'm sure that those who are in this space probably are aware of it already. But the idea, of course, is to have very precise information on every patient that can be used to inform their specific health needs in terms of specific dosing types of medications and so on and so forth. The other one that relates to the library community, I think, is that the idea that, next slide, sorry, is that the National Library of Medicine is, Don Lindbergh has been the director since, I think, 1985 or thereabouts, and clearly transformed and done an absolutely amazing job. I don't think there are another discipline that I can think of that has anything like resources like PubMed and PubMed Central, and many others, of course, around data. But I think the fact that he's retiring is seen as the potential for doing something transformative as well. And there's currently a working group looking at the future of the National Library of Medicine, which will report to Dr. Collins in, I think, in the July timeframe. So this, what I've written here is my own personal view of what I see, in fact, should happen to the National Library of Medicine. So that it should become a sort of a national knowledge portal, which actually preserves more than it does currently. So currently it preserves essentially some data and final publications. But the idea that it actually captured more of the research life cycle and it's done in a free and open way, and in a way that's collaborative, such that the community has a lot more input into and resource and provides a sort of sort of open source kind of approach to. It becomes more of an app store, frankly. You can describe it in various ways, and we can certainly get into that if there's interest in a further discussion about that. But that, I think, at least to the point, is a sort of seen as an opportunity, and it's for what a library and what libraries should become, or could, sorry, I should say could become, or should in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. So that's just another example. So of disruption that sort of I have to deal with all the time. Next slide. So I think I've sort of described some of these things, but I think we're beginning to, there's a lot of willingness to actually change the system across the NIH. And I think that sort of a good news in all of this. And there are other aspects I've sort of discussed. The bad news is I don't think we currently have a sustainability plan for what we're doing. And we're working very hard on that. I don't actually have a slide of that, but I think that if you look at the growth of data that's coming, biomedical research is generating against the flat budget or declining budget in inflation-adjusted terms that the NIH experiences, you can see that things do not scale without change. Those changes are something that we have to really seriously consider. We can talk more about that if you're interested. I think another aspect is we talk about big data, but we don't really know that much about how the data we currently have are used, not in a detailed way. And I know that from maintaining resources as a principal investigator. I don't think the NIH actually asked us the right questions necessarily about that data. I think we're beginning to address that as well. And we need to, I think, as I mentioned already, workforce development is a huge issue, and I'll say a little more about that in a second. Next slide. So out of all of this comes a mission statement. And I think the key part is we consider what we're doing as a sort of digital enterprise that, as I mentioned in my very first slide about the digitization of the healthcare, the biomedical research and healthcare industries, I think that is the driver. And what we're trying to do in this context is to develop an ecosystem to support that. And the part in italics is just the standard, but it's the NIH mission statement. So we're just looking at that from a sort of digital point of view. Next slide. So talk is cheap, but action is quite expensive. And we have an initiative to support this. We spent $32 million on it in fiscal year 14. And as you can see from the graph, that we're spending the order of $100 million over the next several years per year to effectively try and establish this kind of ecosystem that's really data generated. And I think the underlying goal, of course, is to make what we do in biomedical research certainly more cost effective, more efficient, accelerate discovery and so forth, and be more easily replicated, which is part of all of that. And that's all embodied in this Big Data to Knowledge initiative, which is where this money is going and what the program is called. Next slide. So the way we're seeing this is really as a sort of three-legged stool. So there's three components that we're working on simultaneously and in lockstep: communities, policies, and infrastructure. And there's the intersection of all that are clearly things like sustainability and training. So I'm just going to say a little about each of those, but I would say, and just clicking again, the virtuous research cycle is what the researcher actually cares about. It's actually their research, and that's their motivator, that's their driver, and it shouldn't be any other way. So while they're striving to make new discovery, underpinning that are these sort of three components. So let me just say very quickly, I'll give you an example first of all of how that's working in practice. So on the next slide, the slide that says Enigma on the top left-hand side, this is one of the projects that we're actually supporting through the Big Data to Knowledge initiative. We've funded 12 centres of data excellence across the country so far, each of which has a number of participants in various places. So it's a sort of web of interactions. One of them is UCLA's Enigma. It's all over the place, but it's centred there. And from a scientific point of view, what they discovered and recently reported this Nature article is they found 5 novel genetic variants that really have strong association with a particular area of brain development, and associated with that certain neurodysfunction. But this sort of relationship between genotype and phenotype in brain structure is undoubtedly a significant breakthrough. And the fact of the matter is, it came about because of a community. This is a collaboration between a large number of investigators. It came about who are all working on a common problem. It came about because of big data, so-called big data. I don't really like the term, but a lot of data across the spectrum. So many MRI images, collected in a longitudinal study, and GWAS data, genomic information on over 30,000 people. So again, a large study, large collaborative effort. The methods that allowed this to take place, involved homogenizing the data from different sites, standardization, protocols, image analysis, quality assessment, various types of genetic and association studies. So all of which are large-scale computation. Undoubtedly, there's no question that this kind of study is sort of brings together these aspects of infrastructure, community, but also policies involved with this, of course, with respect to the data availability. So the goal of what we're trying to do is really, there's no question that this study like this had lots of challenges in trying to analyze and use this data effectively. And accelerating that process is really what we're all about. And this example just sort of illustrates that. Next slide. So let's look. So that was an example, I would say. Enigma is an example of a community. And I think there are a number of communities that are emerging across various disciplines, but in the life sciences. And I think they're coming together to solve problems around neurodegenerative diseases, problems around genomics and health, and so on. It's just a very interesting time. In terms of data sharing, there are policies we're putting in place, that some mandated by the federal government, some as we're responding to ourselves. So we recently announced a genomic data sharing policy that it's described there at the bottom in that URL. I won't go into that anymore, but so I think that's an example of how we're looking at various types of data and looking at enhancing data sharing. We will be announcing data sharing plans on all research awards. Right now, only awards of over $500,000 direct have associated data sharing plans. But I have to say, as a former investigator, data sharing plans, I think, how should I put it politely, not treated very seriously by investigators, partly because they're not very well enforced by the funding agencies. And we're looking at how to address that better. It's sort of ironic that currently, basically a data sharing plan is not machine readable. So we're actually looking at, when we implement data sharing plans on all grants, that at some point in the not too distant future, that plan would be machine readable. So we would actually be able to see that investigator A says they're going to deposit data B in repository C on date D. We should then be able to go on date D to repository C and see if data B is in there as deposited by PIA. So this will happen effectively automatically. So there would be a way of checking to see if in fact data has actually been put into the repositories in the way people said it would be. So that's just an example of data sharing. I think another aspect of that really appeals to me is the idea that we legitimize data as a form of scholarship. So I think the idea that data citation become very much an accepted element within the NIH framework, so that in grant reports, bid sketches, papers, and so on, we'll begin to see data cited in a formal way and can be included in a citation network. This is, I think, the technical aspects to make this happen are actually in place. There's recently an extension to the JATS format, which is an XML representation used by virtually all journals, as probably many people in this audience know, which is ingested by PubMed and PubMed Central. And it's an extension to that that's just accepted that actually supports data citation in a machine-readable way. It can obviously be expressed in various human-readable forms, but that really opens the door to, I think, really treating data as a legitimate form of scholarship. And I always cite my own particular case as an example of why this is so important. I have a paper that's been cited by, I think, about 19,000 people. It's a very highly cited paper in biomedicine, and yet no one has ever read that paper. No one. Because it's a paper about data. People just use it to cite the data, so why don't they just cite the data directly? It's ridiculous. Anyway, enough of that. And then we've also, this actually happened already, dbGaP, which is the genotype to phenotype database, which includes anonymized human subjects data. There's now agreements in place so that can actually be put into the cloud. This might seem like a small thing, but it was something that was looked at extremely carefully by the NIH, but in fact, it's considered that there are safe havens for this data in those environments, and it really opens the door to new kinds of research on that data. So that's, I think, an important development. Next slide. So I'm just actually slowly step through the different animations on this slide. But effectively, now I'm going to say something about the infrastructure that we're putting in place. So I mentioned we put together these BD2K centers. So each of those centers, the arrow around it really means that it's a virtuous research cycle. They're looking at different types of data. Some are doing translational work that goes from genotype to phenotype. Some are looking at mobile health data. Some are looking at mobility kinds of information. Others are doing neurodegenerative diseases, as you heard, and so on. So there's a series of these centers. And the red, the DDICC part of it, hopefully is appearing on your screen as well. That is a data discovery index consortium that we've actually funded to actually enable us to, or data to be discovered effectively. You can't currently Google data effectively. So this is an effort to make, to actually enable data to be found and catalogued. And once that happens, we can also get measures of how much the data is used and, in fact, what people actually have to say about it. So this is a cataloging exercise. We have a similar one, will soon be underway for software, and one that's about to be announced for standards. So this is all, and these are all connected. And keep flipping through to the end of that slide. Into an environment we're calling the commons, and this is, in part, the underpinning, the infrastructure underpinnings of this ecosystem I'm talking about. So I think the way that works, and it's not just restricted just to NIH-funded labs, it could actually be other labs as well. And there are going to the next slide. And the main builders of this are Vivian Benazzi and George Komasoulis. And if you just flick through these particular animations, the commons consist of essentially a set of digital objects. So whatever goes into the commons, which is essentially a virtual space that's instantiated by several different types of physical places, which I'll say in a second. Then there's, as you can see already, there's like a search function on top of that, and a cataloging function, and then there's the computing platform. And collectively, this is we refer to this as the commons. And so the physical instantiation would have is a conceptual framework composed of public clouds, private clouds, HPC facilities, and other platforms, which is on the next slide. So what it means to be commons compliant is essentially the idea that this space, that individual institutions with their physical infrastructure will agree to have a piece of this place that's shared and accessible to these discovery indices, and that there will be some form of identification of objects, research objects, which means data, software, standards, narrative, final papers, and so forth, exist in this framework. Now, all of that sounds, well, maybe it doesn't to you, next slide, but to me it sounds impressive. But, you know, talk is cheap. You know, how do we enable this? What's the motivation to work in this space? Well, it's actually starting to happen of its own accord by these communities who are really looking for this common framework in which to better share various components of the research enterprise. But we're going to drive this with a business model. And you should see a slide of a business model, which is rather complicated, and I'll just explain it very simply. What happens right now is that you write a grant to the NIH, and you might put a line item in it for computing. And let's say you put in $100,000. Well, what happens to that money when the 1 in 5 times that you get that grant? That either you spend it all on that equipment, or maybe you siphon a bit off, or maybe something else happens to it. Or you end up buying servers which sit in a lab or on a computer center, and there's no actual mapping of supply to demand. That equipment might be overutilized, but more than likely it will be underutilized. So, you know, the idea here is we're not going to give you $100,000 for computing infrastructure. We're going to give you let's just sweeten the pot a little and say we'll give you $125,000 of credit. And you can spend that credit in any commons compliant resource that you wish. And that could be your own environment and your own institution if that becomes commons compliant, or it could be in a cloud environment and so on. And you're going to spend that money as an investigator, where you get the best value for your money. And that is sort of how we're proposing to drive this. We're not doing this way to start with. We're just going to experiment with it in a set of agile experiments, which we will evaluate to see whether, in fact, this truly does bring benefit to the system. So that's, I think, an important piece of it, and there's a whole infrastructure and contractual agreement going in place to make this happen, and George is handling that, and that's moving along nicely. So that, just to sort of end up, because if there is time and questions are going to work in this environment, it would be great to actually hear comments or thoughts or questions from the audience. So you should, on the last slide, see my email address. I'd be happy to have you contact me with questions or thoughts about all of this. But just to sort of summarize, you know, I think we're putting in place this ecosystem or attempting to, and we'll be using the BD2K funds to drive this, to you know, see if we can produce something that is going to accelerate the rate of discovery in this new, you know, really data-driven environment that we've now become. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry I also got a bad cold, which I didn't want to mention, but I'm sure listening to me droning on was probably pretty bad. But thanks for your attention anyway.
So thank you, Dr. Bourne. We are able to take a couple of questions, and the way this will work is if you have a question, you can say what your question is, and I will repeat it so Dr. Bourne can hear it through the microphone. Okay, so because he may not be able to hear you, but he would hear me. So if you don't mind, stand up, identify yourself, say your question, and I will repeat the question into the microphone. Are there any questions? Yes. So Dr. Bourne, the question has to do with the timeline for the requirements for the infrastructure for the commons.
The reason I'm asking is because I work with our school as a data conservancy project.
Yes.
Citation. We have a team of people ready to implement something.
Okay. So the individuals from Johns Hopkins, and they're ready to implement something, and they want to know when this is going to be a go.
Right, so that's a good question. So first of all, I should say that this is not, in principle, our own idea. I mean, I think there's the notion of a commons is cropping up in various environments, including at various places at the NIH. So the cancer cloud pilots, which are currently underway, are examples of pilots that are within the commons environment. So that is just one. The Human Microbiome Project is something that's also underway. Now, in terms of, I want to emphasize that there are various efforts in this space, some working with us, some working separately, but there are things underway already. In terms of the timeline itself, I would say that we are, this fiscal year, about to make some funding announcements to enable people to work in this environment. So we hope to have a few agile experiments, a couple of which, or several of which are already running, and a number more that will be running by the end of the fiscal year, which is in the end of, I guess, the end of September. And then next year, if things appear to be going well, there will be further funding calls to push this along next year. So I would keep an eye on the BDTK website to find out funding calls. We're also developing and will release pretty shortly Commons compliant documents, which really just sort of describe the concept of what we hope people will comply with to be part of this. And I would say that the sort of examples of it sort of happening organically. So, for example, we're funding a center with David Hausler, Cancer Genomics Center. But out of that, and part of the work of a large community, the Global Alliance for Genomic Health, which is now over 200 organizations, I believe, they've actually started working in this environment already. They're developing APIs to different data types to sort of create this level of accessibility in a pretty open environment. And these are APIs into human subjects data where there is control over the data, but particular elements can be returned. So, for example, you could ask a question through a resource called Beacon, which just says, is there an example of this particular genetic variant existing at this position on chromosome X, or whatever chromosome. And that will go out, query a whole bunch of different resources in this environment, and return that answer without giving away any other kind of information. So these kind of API developments and so on, this is already happening, and it'll be interesting to see over time whether this dies or whether this sort of it accelerates and gains momentum. But that's the sort of short-term timeline.
Any other questions? Yes, Sarah.
Sarah McCord, Mass College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. My question is, what sort of funding opportunities for workforce development do you envision? Curricular design, specific populations, specific outcomes?
So the question has to do with funding opportunities for curriculum development, and if you could say more for workforce curriculum development in this space and the opportunities there might have, especially I would add for librarians to take part.
Yeah. So I would first of all, I'll get on the website. There's a layout of the things that we're currently funding, and I would say that I just talked about, in fact, the presentation in SlideShare. The AAAS, I gave a presentation on our various workforce efforts and curriculum development efforts. Just to sort of indicate there's a bit of teeth in this, one of the analyses we did is we looked at how much was being spent on training across the different 27 institutes and centers at NIH. More is being spent prorated against their respective budgets by NLM than any of the other institutes. VD2K, as a separate program, was number 2 in its funding. So we're actually spending a significant amount on curriculum development and also workforce development around, obviously people who are training programs at the doctoral and postdoctoral level, but also for retraining of individuals. So programs where individuals can go and spend short sabbaticals in research labs that are data intensive to learn those skill sets and take them back. We're also there's a funding call out for this already, funding a coordination center for training materials in data science. So, it comes back to you can't find data. You can't necessarily find the best training materials either. We're actually working with a group in Europe to develop a metadata system to describe virtual and physical courses that we can then use to build a catalog of these things, which hopefully will be somewhat self-maintaining, that really describes everything that's available. But the coordination center will have a strong role in defining, first of all, the catalog, but also where we put funds into courseware development. Hopefully that sort of helps. So that's ongoing.
Just a local response to that question. The New England region has a course on data management best practices, and we did apply for B2K2 funding to put that course online. So we submitted that application at the recent round. So we're hoping that we'll get money to make that course available to the community in which we are serving. Just a plug for our proposal. Yep, that's right, exactly. And thanks to the National Library of Medicine. Okay, one other question. I actually had one about your personal vision for the National Library of Medicine. And if you could, I know this is your personal vision, but I also wondered from your personal perspective how that would potentially change the National Library of Medicine if it were to take on your vision and librarians' roles.
So, well, first of all, I think we need to be extremely careful that we don't disrupt what the amazingly good work that's already happened there and continues to happen. So I just want to emphasize that this is not sort of changing course, but what else can be done? So I've actually heard reference. I think if you're a casual user of NLM, then you would be more than happy with the services that are provided. You can tell me if that's not the case. But I think if you're a developer, I've heard many times this notion that, it's NIH, not invented here. That it's sort of a closed environment and that there's not enough openness and shared development effort with the community so that the best developments within the community can be embraced within, and sort of being overlaid to the knowledge at the National Library. I'll give you a specific example. I think PubMed Central is, I'm a big advocate of open access, as I'm sure many of you are. But I actually wrote an editorial a number of years ago that effectively said, open access, where's the killer app? I don't think that there's been particularly effective use of the open access component, and of course it's not all of it, but of PubMed Central. And and I think it's not easy to do that in the current environment. So there are not particularly good APIs into the content. Actually getting the content is not as straightforward as it should be. I would be, we've talked about an early project being putting the open access component of PubMed Central into the Commons and really opening up people's ability to develop applications on top of it. So that's sort of, an example of what I mean by the sort of open knowledge framework that I think needs to be put on top of this. It's really a sort of notion that, you know, of being a real public library in a sense, but in the new, in a virtual world of the future, or now for that matter. And, you know, I think really having the community being a larger part of what happens in the National Library of Medicine.
Thank you. One last question. Any other potential questions for our speaker before we move on to the next part of our program? No other questions? I think that's it. Again, thank you, Dr. Bourne, for coming in this way.